Welcome to Around the SEC, where we take a trip around the greatest conference in the nation, following the biggest storylines and making bold predictions. I'm your host, Mikayla Kelly.
And I'm Micah Farmer. Today we look at Alabama and Georgia's impressive performances that just may have sealed them a spot in Atlanta for the SEC championship. We also recap Auburn's win in Vandy, discuss the playoff rankings and Heisman frontrunners, and of course, pick our SEC teams of the week. All that and much more on today's episode of Around the SEC.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Around the SEC. Now, if you watched last week, you know I made a bet with Micah that if the Jets beat the Chargers in Monday Night Football, he would have to wear a Jets hat on the show and vice versa. Well, that was a mistake because look at me now. But I do think I'm rocking the powder blue, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, I think it looks great.
Well, my Jets might have lost, but you know who didn't? Our Auburn Tigers. What a win and what an environment it was up in Nashville. It was just a sea of orange and blue. I was up in Nashville this weekend. You would have thought we were in the city of Auburn. Honestly, anywhere you went in the city, not just the stadium, which was practically a home game. You could call it neutral site, but I think that happens regardless at any Vandy game. But
yeah,
it was just awesome to see Auburn travel, and I think that's something special about this fan base. But what did you think about that game? I'm sure you were watching it on Saturday.
Yes, I was flipping back and forth between it and then Missouri, Georgia, but I was enjoying both games. For Auburn, that one, we ended up actually playing very well. I know it's Vandy, but still good performance overall, especially from the defense. And like you said, this Auburn crowd traveled like no one's business. I know Vandy doesn't have the biggest fan base out there, but still, that stadium was almost entirely navy and orange.
Well, even though we're both happy to see an Auburn win, there was a lot more teams that did not make us as happy. And it looks like we'll most likely be forced to watch our rival schools yet again duke it out for the SEC title. So let's start with one of those teams, Alabama. We said that if Alabama wanted to seal their spot in the West, they had to beat LSU. And they did in a big way, taking them down 42-28. We said if LSU can get on a shootout, they win. But instead, the Tide won that shootout. Is it the LSU defense just that bad, or is Alabama a sneaky contender this season?
I think it's a little bit of both. The LSU defense is absolutely horrific, but this Alabama team has been improving all year, and now they honestly look pretty good. In the fourth quarter of this game, LSU was only down 7 with the ball. They were down 35-28, and a crucial Jaden Daniels interception led to an Alabama touchdown. They went up by 14. That was pretty much all she wrote for that one. So the LSU defense obviously did not play well in this one, but also mistakes from the offense cost the Tigers this game.
Like you just said, I think we saw that Jaden Daniels is human. He makes mistakes, but he still carried that team with 219 yards and 2 touchdowns while running for 163 yards. Prior to that unfortunate injury, luckily it looks like he's coming back, so not too terrible, but I don't think LSU was coming back regardless after he went down, like you said, because of that defense. But let's talk about Jalen Milroe for a second, because we said get Jalen Milroe in a shootout. He won't win. He can't sustain it. But he said, nope, I'm playing Jaden Daniels, so I'm going to play just like him. And he set a tied single-game record for touchdowns. And he's proving to be a dual threat, rushing for 155 yards and 4 touchdowns, passing for another 219 yards. So this kid is one to watch and could really be the future of this program because Alabama just keeps improving, and it's scary to see they might creep in.
For sure. I think all season we've been talking about if they just make Milroe the focal point of this offense, we might really see him shine, and they did in this one, and he went absolutely crazy, as you said, on the ground and through the air both.
And, of course, props to that Alabama defense. They continue to be consistent every week. That interception was critical. So
for sure.
Here come the Tide, I guess, yet again. Just when we thought they were on a down year, they're not.
Yeah. Over in the SEC East, the Missouri Tigers traveled down to Athens to take on the defending champs Georgia in a game I had marked almost all season as an upset. Despite leading in the third quarter and being within 3 in the fourth, the Tigers were unable to pull off the upset, losing 30-21. What do you think Mizzou could have done different in this one in order to shock the world?
I think this was one Missouri could have and should have won. And I think in games like this where teams at such high caliber are playing, it's really even. It's the little things that can change the course of the entire game. And I think for Missouri, what really did it was that Brady Cook short pass interception that was picked off by Nazir Stackhouse. with a chance to tie, they could have easily scored, tied at 27-27, but instead they threw the interception and set Georgia up to basically seal it, get to 30, and it was just over for the Missouri team. But they were playing pretty even. I mean, they were leading 13-10 early, but they just couldn't sustain it. And Carson Beck played an almost near flawless game. He's another quarterback that continues to improve.
Yes.
So I just think it ended up being an unlucky day for Missouri, but they showed that they can hang around with Georgia. They could have won that game.
They played really well, especially Cody Schrader. He ran for over 100 yards in this one and a touchdown. And in the third and fourth quarter was just absolutely running through this Georgia defense with outside stretch runs. Georgia couldn't stop it, and literally the very next play when they went away from it was the play Brady Cook threw an interception. So I think you maybe should have stuck with Schrader there, but, coulda, woulda, shoulda for Missouri in this one.
Well, now that we've touched on both Alabama and Georgia, I think it's safe to say we'll be seeing these two juggernauts duke it out again in December in Atlanta for the SEC championship. Obviously, it's not completely sealed because there's still games to play, but do you see it turning out like this?
I think it does. You have to have some crazy scenarios for them to not make it there, including Alabama losing to Kentucky and Georgia losing out in the SEC. So I think they're pretty much both booked in at this point. As old as that matchup might be by now, I think we're going to see it again.
And not only that, do you think that the winner of that SEC championship in December will be representing the SEC in the playoffs this year? Because I've been saying all season, I really only think that there'll be one team, unless crazy things could happen. A lot's going to change in these next few weeks with the playoff rankings, but do you see the winner of this SEC championship being the representation for the SEC in the playoffs this season?
I think if it's Georgia, it's all but guaranteed. However, if it's Alabama, the issue Alabama has is Texas is in front of them, and if Texas wins the Big 12, and Alabama's only loss is to that Texas team in front of them who beat them in Tuscaloosa, how are you going to put Alabama in over Texas when you have the head-to-head right there? So I think that could be difficult for Alabama to make it in if they win, but Georgia should be booked in if they win the SEC.
I definitely agree with that, but I don't see Alabama beating Kentucky this weekend, and we know a win in Kentucky seals it for them.
For sure.
The only way they wouldn't get in is a loss to Kentucky and Auburn, which I'm not counting out the Iron Bowl. I definitely think Auburn has a shot in this one.
Kentucky just is not good enough, though.
No.
After Georgia's win over Mizzou, many think the Dogs might already have an undefeated season booked in. However, their last two SEC games are no cupcakes. They welcome Ole Miss to Athens this weekend and then travel to Knoxville next weekend to take on Tennessee, then finish the season with an away game at rival Georgia Tech. Do you think any of these teams can pull off the upset, or will Georgia cruise into Atlanta undefeated once again?
Well, like I said, Missouri could have easily came in and win. They kind of melt down in the last two quarters, but if Ole Miss could pull this off, they could blow the college football playoffs wide open, and then they're still in the hunt, which is crazy to say. I don't think any of us were seeing that coming at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, who's going to leave a one-loss Ole Miss SEC champion out if they manage to pull that off?
I had people saying they're finishing last in the SEC West, and they are far from that this season. The only bad thing for them going into this Georgia matchup, their defense hasn't necessarily been the biggest asset for them. It's been their dynamic offense, high-scoring offense that's carried them this season. And unfortunately, Georgia converts on third down best in the country, better than anyone else. And so this defense really needs to come in hot if they want to beat Georgia.
Yeah, I think Ole Miss is a style of team that over Georgia's last couple years, and they've been an elite team, that does not match up well against Georgia with a high-flying offense and not a great defense. Usually Georgia puts those teams down very quickly. I think the tripping point for Georgia could be Neyland Stadium in Knoxville. If Neyland is fired up and Tennessee is ready to go, that can become a tough game for the Bulldogs very quickly. And then I also want to look at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, I don't think is getting a lot of credit this year, but they've beaten multiple top 25 teams. Haynes King is running that offense to almost perfection right now, and that game is in Atlanta. So I don't think Georgia Tech could win that game. I think that game's going to be a lot closer than a lot of people think.
Rivalry games are always crazy. You never know what's going to happen. But just to circle back to the two teams they get, in terms of Ole Miss, the one thing that is working in their favor is that Georgia's run defense is not necessarily anything special. And the Reds right now have Quidshad Judkins, who's coming off 3 straight games rushing over 100 yards. So
yeah, he had a bit of a slow start of the season, but he is firing right now.
Oh, for sure. Him get him active, feed him the ball. Dart's pretty mobile if he wants to be, and that's going to be the key factor if they want to win in this game. And then, like you said, Neyland Stadium, very special. They've won 14 of their past games at home, but you know what their most recent loss was at home was to?
Probably Georgia.
It was in 2021 against the Georgia Bulldogs, just 2 months before they headed to their first national championship since 1980. So
what you're saying is we can blame Tennessee for Georgia winning over and over.
Oh, 100%. They hand it to them every year. There's teams in the East that can beat Georgia, but, instead they just hand it to them. And before we head to break, of course we have to talk about Auburn's 31-15 win on the road at Vanderbilt, which was practically a neutral site, borderline home game. But still, this is the first time since 2019 that Auburn has been favored by double digits on the road and has actually covered. What pieces of this Auburn team stood out to you, and do you think they finally have the confidence to keep winning, especially in a road matchup against Arkansas that seems to be improving, especially with this new offensive coordinator?
Well, I think it starts and ends right now with this Auburn team with Jarquez Hunter. He had a bit of a slow start to the year, but his last 3 games, he is averaging 8.1 yards per carry and is leading the SEC in rushing yards with 421. Coming into this 3-game stretch, he only had 1 career game at Auburn with multiple touchdowns, and 2 of his last 3 he's had 2 touchdowns. So if Auburn can get Hunter going, and really against this Arkansas defense, that shouldn't be too hard because they looked weak up front on both sides of the ball. If you can get him going, I think that starts your recipe to success.
Which, shout out to Jarquez Hunter. I think he's finally playing like the Jarquez we all thought going to the season. I think a lot of fans were worried early on because he just wasn't getting any playing. He was playing, but it wasn't anything special. We really thought he was going to carry this team, but now I think he really parallels Quinshon Judkins. Like we just realized, they both started out kind of slow, but they're really picking up. And just a few stats to point out about Jarquez, who had 2 touchdowns alone in the first quarter and finished the game with a career-high 183 yards, which Auburn has not had a 100-yard rusher in the first half since Tank Bigsby in 2020.
Yeah, it's been a minute.
And another thing about this Auburn team, this snapped an 8-game SEC road skid. Didn't realize that we haven't won an SEC matchup on the road, which last season was absolutely abysmal. So, no, go figure. But also, I think we need to point out this defense,
they're so
which
good.
Ranks number 1 in the country in red zone defense. That's absolutely critical. We saw 3 sacks on Saturday, an interception from Nehemiah Pritchett. So, thank God for this defense.
Yes.
All I got to say, because it seems like this new offensive coordinator really knows how to utilize KJ Jefferson, who still, to me, despite what this season shows in terms of wins and losses, I still think he's top 5, borderline top 3 quarterback in the SEC.
Unfortunately for him, he doesn't really have an offensive line playing in front of him, and that's hurt him a lot this year.
Him and Spencer Rattler both. It's unfortunate. And guess what? I would still take either of them at Auburn. But
for real.
If Auburn happens to be Arkansas, then they'll probably cruise past New Mexico State, hopefully. And then they enter the Iron Bowl at home hot off a 4-game win streak. How scared should Alabama be if this is the case?
I think that game all depends on how the battle in the trenches go. If Auburn can't slow down Alabama's offensive line in the run game and they can't get a push with their offensive line against the Bama defensive front, this game is not going to go well for the Tigers. But if Auburn can get their offensive and defensive lines playing really well, I think that's where you can get Alabama on the back foot. And if you have momentum with how this run game has been recently, if they carry that through Arkansas, and you would hope New Mexico State, if you get an offensive line coming in with momentum versus that Alabama team, I think you could maybe see Auburn have a chance.
Well, I've been saying this. I said we could lose in Arkansas. Heck, we could lose to New Mexico State, and I still think we have a chance in the Iron Bowl. There's just something about the atmosphere at home in Jordan-Hare for the Iron Bowl that's nothing like I've ever seen before. 2 years ago, we hung in there. That was a team that ended up going to the national championship. We hung in there with a backup quarterback. TJ Finley was playing quarterback.
Yeah, that Auburn team had no business.
Coming off a loss to South Carolina, tons of backups, tons of injury, and we still put them into overtime. So this is a game that is pure passion to me that we could lose these next 2 games, and I still think we have a chance coming in. So we'll have to see in 2 weeks.
We'll have to see.
When we come back, we pick our SEC teams of the week, then debate the playoff rankings and Heisman favorites. right here on Around the SEC. Welcome back to Around the SEC. It's time to pick our SEC Teams of the Week. And for me, there were really only two options. And so I'm taking the Alabama Crimson Tide. And I don't want to beat a dead horse since we've gone so much in depth today on them. But put simply, they proved me wrong by winning the shootout, absolutely handled one of the best offenses in the country, and punched their ticket to the SEC championship. This team has unfortunately been slept on. Micah, who's your SEC Team of the Week?
As you said, only really two options this week, and I'm going to go with the other option.
Our favorite teams.
For sure, Georgia defending home turf against Missouri in a game they really needed to win, a game that a lot of people, including myself, thought Missouri could come in and win, and Georgia played really well in this game. There's no way around that, so credit to them. Quick little shout out to Arkansas for getting their first ever win in the Swamp this past weekend, but yeah, it really is Alabama and Georgia this weekend in the SEC. Earlier this week, the second iteration of the college football playoff rankings were released. Georgia sits at number 2 with Alabama down at 8. What do you think of the rankings overall, and where do you think the SEC stands in regard to making the playoffs this season?
Right now, there's not much I would change. You can't really argue. I think if you're undefeated, you should be ranked, and right now there's 5 undefeated teams. They're in the top 5. I think the one thing I would change would be the order. Right now, it's Ohio State, Georgia, FSU, and Washington. I definitely do agree. I think Ohio State should sit at 1, and this is simply because they have the wins over Notre Dame and Penn State. However, I do think Michigan can come in and beat them down the line, but I'm very much into what's your resume now, not who can hypothetically beat you, is how I go into these rankings. Could any of these teams beat Ohio State? Yeah. Could any of these teams beat each other? Of course, but right now this is the way it needs to be, and I agree with Ohio State at first. Georgia's currently dominating the best conference in college football, leading the SEC, so put them at a top 2 team. Could they be number 1? Sure. Then I have FSU, which appears to be controversial, but they're dominating the ACC and beating teams that have been historically hard matchups for them. And I don't care if Clemson's gotten worse, but they got past Clemson, Duke, and LSU, and I don't really see them losing another game. So right now I do see them as a true number 3. And the one switch for me would be switching Washington and Michigan. And that's because right now Washington's the best team in the Pac-12. And I honestly think the Pac-12 has been the most competitive division and conference in college football this season. And they have wins over a killer Oregon team who's dropping 60 on teams. They have a win over Oregon and USC led by Caleb Williams. So
on the road as well for that game.
They deserve that spot. I do have Oregon sitting at 6 right now.
Yes, for sure.
Because
they've looked the most impressive of any one-loss team.
However, we will most likely see them play each other in the Pac-12 championship, and if Oregon can beat them, then I could see there being a switch. And the reason I have Michigan sitting at 5, just off the top 4, is because they really don't have a great win on their resume. They do get Penn State on Saturday, and that will definitely help boost their resume. And they're in a bit of a Michigan investigation right now. So that's kind of where I stand. I don't know if you have any other opinions, but that's kind of where I'm at.
I do have one problem with this set of rankings, and I know you said you like Ohio State at 1. I personally don't at all. I think if you're looking at resume, like you were talking about, sure, the Penn State win is great, but the Notre Dame win looks worse and worse every week. And if you're going pure resume, do you take the Washington resume or do you take the Ohio State resume? I think it's not that far apart. And if you're splitting hairs on that, I think you then move to who looks the best on the field so far this season. And for me, that's not the Ohio State Buckeyes. Kyle McCord has been throwing a lot of interceptions. If it weren't for Marvin Harrison Jr., this offense would not be in a good spot right now. So personally, for me, I would not have Ohio State at 1. But as far as the rest of the rankings, I don't have much of an issue with them.
Fair. And we're going to see this change because a lot of these teams are going to have to play in their championships, and that's going to change a lot of things. And I don't see this at all being the top 4 come December by any means. I see Michigan beating Ohio State.
I do as well.
So
the one thing you have to worry about then, I would worry about if a one-loss Ohio State with the loss to Michigan would maybe get beneficial treatment over, say, an Oregon or a Texas, which I would just absolutely hate to see. But we've seen it before in 2014 with Baylor and TCU getting left out. So.
It is definitely unfortunate. That's just how it is historically, but we'll see. And I'm excited. This is the most in the dark I've been about playoff rankings, like, I really think this is the most unpredictable it's ever been, and I love it. And I wish the 12-team playoff system was already in place because this would have been the best year for it. And I know the second they put it in place, it's going to be a boring season. I just know it. But now I want to talk Heisman frontrunners. I want to hear your thoughts on who you think will be invited in December, and who is your favorite to win the Heisman this season?
So for me, it starts with the Pac-12 and Michael Penix and Bo Nix. I think whoever wins the Pac-12 title game between Washington and Oregon, that team's quarterback ends up winning the Heisman,
100%.
especially if both teams don't lose again before that game, which I don't think they will. Both of those quarterbacks are playing out of their minds this season. As far as who else gets invited, I think J.J. McCarthy from Michigan will be there because I think Michigan beats Ohio State. And then for your last spot, it's kind of a toss-up for me between Jordan Travis and Jaden Daniels because both have played really well. I think Jaden Daniels has the more impressive stats on the year, but obviously with Jordan Travis, that's an undefeated Florida State team. So if I were to guess right now, I would think Travis gets the nod, but Daniels definitely is in the conversation.
Like you said, I think in terms of winner, whoever wins the Pac-12 championship is winning the Heisman. I don't think there's any way about it. We've played enough of the season to know that that's who it's going to come down between. Do think J.J. McCarthy gets the invite as well, and I'm not saying he will get the last spot. I do think that Jaden Daniels deserves the last spot. He's played absolutely out of his mind on a team with an abysmal defense.
Yes.
And it's just unfortunate that those losses are on his resume, but I don't think any of them were his fault. If you look at the stats of the games they lost, they're crazy. The Ole Miss game that they lost, they dropped 40-something points.
Neither quarterback deserved to lose that game. Those defenses just did not show up.
Exactly. And then something kind of controversial I've been seeing lately is people saying that Jalen Milroe could be sneaking into the Heisman invite.
No.
I don't know about that one.
He would have to put up similar, if not better, stat lines to the LSU game for every game the rest of the way, and then convincingly beat Georgia with a 4 more touchdown performance in that game, in my mind, for him to get invited, and I just don't see that happening personally. So Milroe, maybe next year, but not this year.
I definitely could see if he comes back and plays like he has been the second half of the season, he could 100% be a favorite next season. And then just one last thing about the Heisman before we move on. I think that 4th spot would have went to Brock Bowers had he not gotten hurt. I really think it would have, but it's unfortunate. It's a Hendon Hooker situation, and so we're going to be seeing all quarterbacks up in New York.
Once again. Before we head to break, earlier this week, the NFL and NFLPA announced that underclassmen who have declared for the NFL draft will now be allowed to participate in college all-star games such as the Senior Bowl. Mikayla, what do you think of this rule change?
I don't know. I'm kind of indifferent to it. Maybe once it plays out, I'll feel a little bit different. But I don't know. I'm kind of leaning more against it. I think the kids that are declaring early, they're really good. They're probably going to get drafted. They're going to go on bigger. Kids that are going to the Senior Bowl, this is most likely their last year playing football. Not always, but potentially their last season playing football. And I think it's nice for them to kind of have their own recognition, go out that way. Also, I think it could be potentially risky having draft declared players going to a Senior Bowl type game, but I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting, especially because you're opening up the pool to a way bigger amount of people, and I don't know how they're going to narrow it down. And I do think the seniors not declaring for the draft might get passed over for people that are. So
yeah, I actually don't hate this. I would expect them to increase the number of invites issued to accommodate for, as you say, the larger pool of players now available. But every year, the Senior Bowl one-on-ones are so big to watch for scouting. And for those underclassmen that are invited to be able to showcase their talent in these one-on-ones, as you say, they're usually a bit higher up, hence why they're declaring early. But seeing those talented seniors versus underclassmen in those one-on-one matchups, I think will be huge for the NFL draft process and scouting. So while I do think it kind of stinks to take a bit of the exclusivity away, overall, I think for the whole NFL draft process, I like the change.
I think there's definitely pros and cons, and we're just going to see how it plays out, and then maybe my opinion will change. Who knows? But right now, I'm just kind of indifferent to it. I don't really know. And when we come back, we make game predictions right here on Around the SEC. Welcome back to Around the SEC. Now let's make some game predictions for the biggest matchups across the conference this weekend. Starting off between the battle of potentially the worst teams in the SEC right now.
Give Mississippi State some credit. Come on.
We've got the Vanderbilt Commodores coming off a crushing from Auburn, traveling down to Columbia, South Carolina to take on the Gamecocks, who just got a big win over the Jacksonville State
Barely.
Gamecocks.
Listen, if Jacksonville State would have won that game, that was my SEC team of the week.
As they should. Put them in the conference. Right now, South Carolina comes in as a 13.5-point favorite, and I kind of think that's a little absurd. I guess they get the home field advantage, but who are you taking in this game?
I completely agree with you about the spread. I think it's almost gone under the radar how terrible this South Carolina team has been this year, struggling, like we said, with Jacksonville State. I think the environment, though, in Williams-Brice is going to carry them to a win in this one, although I don't love the spread.
I don't love the spread either. I'm going to take South Carolina either way. Not thrilled about it. I don't think it's going to be a pretty game necessarily. I don't think they necessarily cruise past them. I saw some decent things from Vanderbilt in the short time I was watching them on Saturday, but I still got to take the Gamecocks at home. Next, we've got Florida traveling to Death Valley to take on LSU. Originally, we had thought Jaden Daniels might not be in this matchup, and then I think it would have been a little bit more even, but it looks like he'll be playing. So who are you taking in this matchup? Also a huge spread.
Yeah, I honestly like the spread a lot more in this game than I did on the last one. I think the name Death Valley is going to be pretty appropriate for what's happening to this Florida team this week. This Florida defense is allowing over 450 yards per game in the SEC, and with this LSU offense, that just is not a recipe for success for the Gators. So give me LSU big.
Honestly, I was taking LSU regardless. I just do think Death Valley is a special place. Florida just lost to Arkansas in the swamp. So for that reason, Jaden Daniels is going to drop numbers on them. So I'm taking the LSU Tigers as well. Next one, this could be a tough one for Auburn on the road. We've got Auburn traveling up to Fayetteville to take on Arkansas. And right now it's a 2.5. Arkansas is a 2.5-point favorite. But I think it's a fairly even matchup. Who are you taking in this one?
I think this is going to be a really good game, a really close game. I think Arkansas's weakness in the trenches comes back to bite them in this one, though. Even though they're at home, I think Auburn is able to go in and get another SEC road win.
I think luckily for Auburn, they're rolling off confidence. They finally got the big road win they needed. If they win this game, they become bowl eligible, so it just means more. I think it's going to be pretty close the whole game. Had it been played in Auburn, I think it's an easy win, hands down, but Auburn struggled on the road this season. But I still think they're coming off the high, and I think they win in a close matchup. So I'm also taking the Auburn Tigers, and maybe I'm biased. Hey. This one I've been struggling with.
Yeah.
And it's Tennessee traveling up to take on Missouri on their home turf. It's a 1-point spread in favor of the Vols. So I'm curious to see who you're taking in this matchup.
I think that Missouri is in danger of coming out flat in this one. After the devastating loss to Georgia, after how well they played for a lot of that game, I still do think they get this win, though. The Missouri run defense has quietly been very good this season. They were able to slow down Georgia in that game, and I think once you limit Tennessee to a more one-dimensional offense, Joe Milton starts to struggle. And I think because of that, Missouri's going to be able to win this one.
You just said run defense, and Tennessee's pretty reliant on their run attack. So for that reason, and because they're home, I'm also taking Missouri, but this one could really swing either way. And honestly, if Tennessee wins, then that does not help Georgia. So honestly, I don't know. I really don't, but I'm going to take Missouri here. But I really think this one could swing either way. Out of all the games this season, I know there's been a lot of ones where I've been back and forth, but this one, seriously, is a true even matchup for me. And so I don't really know, but I'm taking Missouri.
Yeah.
Then we have maybe the biggest game of this weekend, and that's the Ole Miss Rebels traveling to Athens because, Georgia gets all their hard games at home, and they get the dynamic offense led by Jackson Dart on their home turf. So who are you taking? What do you think about this 10.5-point spread?
This 10.5-point spread, I think a lot of people are going to call ridiculous. I think this is going to be one of those spreads that ends up hitting late in the game after a close game because Georgia gets a late score to pull away and make it look not as close as the game itself was. I do think Georgia's going to win this one. I do not like the personnel matchup for Ole Miss in this game, and it being in Athens as well. Give me the Bulldogs.
I think the defense will be their downfall, or I could see Jackson Dart potentially melting down in this game.
He doesn't play super well under pressure, and that's not something you want to have going on against Georgia.
To verge a team like Georgia, you cannot crack under the pressure, and unfortunately, a lot of teams do, and a lot of great quarterbacks do as well. I think we're going to see a repeat of Missouri last week, and for that reason, I'm taking the Georgia Bulldogs. That's all we have for you today on Around the SEC. I'm Mikayla Kelly.
And I'm Micah Farmer.
We'll see you next time. And this can go.